Hi, and thanks for tuning in. My name's Louise Lau, and I'm an Associate and Senior Consulting Actuary in the Public Sector Consulting team at Barnett Waddingham. In this session, I'll be discussing employer covenant and how we can manage this as LGPS funds. There is some regulatory information on this slide for you to pause and have a read of, and so I'll just move on to the next slide. As a very quick introduction to Barnett Waddingham, we are a leading independent consultancy in the UK across risk, pensions, investment, and insurance. We're one of the biggest providers of fund actuary advice to the LGPS, so we have a lot of experience in helping LGPS funds deal with employer covenant. So today I'll introduce you to employer covenant, then look at options with you on how we can assess and manage it. So first, what is employer covenant? The formal definition by the pensions regulator is that the employer covenant is a measure of the ability of the employer to meet its obligations to the scheme. In practice, this is about the employer's financial ability and willingness to meet its obligations. And why is employer covenant important? In terms of the LGPS, it can influence the administering authority's decisions on an employer's funding strategy and contribution plan. There might be employers in the fund who are at risk of defaulting, being unable to pay their pensions contributions, and leaving behind a sizable deficit in the fund. So carrying out an analysis of employer covenant will help the fund identify these employers and increase the fund's knowledge of its employers. The fund can then use this knowledge to feed into funding strategies and contribution plans to help minimise the likelihood of unrecoverable deficits. For example, if the employer covenant is strong, then an administering authority might give more flexibility to the employer when it comes to ongoing funding or when exiting the fund. It might also affect the fund's views on whether it needs security from an employer, and similarly, the employer might be keen to offer their fund security to get a more affordable contribution plan. Employer covenant isn't a static measure. It will change over time. And where you need this information, you should be regularly tracking any changes in an employer's covenant. In general, funds can get a feel for covenant strength from day-to-day engagement with employers. For example, if an employer is struggling financially, it's likely they will be paying contributions late or even missing contributions. Commercial employers might be scaling back their workforce, or where the employer is proactive, they might already have approached the fund to discuss their options. However, there are more formal methods to assess employer covenant and to help avoid getting to the stage where it starts having a negative impact on an employer's participation in the fund. So I show some of these here. Firstly, we've got qualitative. You might look at employer characteristics, which can include the type of employer or sector, whether they're open or closed to new members, whether they have any guarantees in place, and how long they're expected to remain a participating employer in the fund. Where you're looking at lots of employers, you might put them into different risk categories, which will help you break down how you'll treat different employers based on their level of risk. To do all of this, you might also issue a questionnaire to employers for them to provide you with information that will help you consider their covenant. If we want a bit more detail, then we can do something in the middle, which is a quantitative approach. One option is to look at pension fund risk. What is their ongoing and cessation position? What is their maturity? In other words, what is their balance of actives to deferred and pensioner members, which in turn affects how long they might participate in the fund for, their contribution levels, and their cash flow position. Then you can also look at credit risk score. This tells you how a professional rating agency assesses an employer's level of risk. Ratings agencies will look at a mix of financial and non-financial information to make their assessment of how risky a company is. The riskier they are, the more likely they are to default. And it's likely you will want to combine these two pieces of information to look at the overall risk. If you have two high-risk employers, you'd be more concerned about the one that has a lot of deficit rather than the one that's sitting in surplus with some guarantees also sitting behind them. And finally, the third one on this slide is what we call a detailed approach. This involves commissioning covenant assessments from covenant specialists. This is one of the pricier options, but it might be necessary when you're focusing on one particularly risky employer, rather than an approach that you would use for all employers in the fund. These three approaches, going from left to right, become more detailed and robust, but also more costly. Different funds will therefore take different approaches depending on their employers, the resource available, and their attitude to risk. Once you have an idea of how risky an employer is, in other words, how weak or strong their covenant is, then you can think about how this can be allowed for in funding and in their participation in the fund. These are some of the main steps that could be considered. You can check if the employer can get a guarantee from an employer or a company with a stronger covenant, for example, a council to which it is related or a parent company. You could obtain external security, which the fund can call on should the employer default on its obligations. Examples of this include bonds or first charge on the employer's assets, such as property. And finally, regular monitoring. Make sure you're aware of how the employer's situation is changing and if it gets worse, at which point you might need to consider further action. It's important to monitor their funding position. If it deteriorates and the employer's covenant isn't strong, then you might want to seek security or guarantees if you haven't already. And make sure to monitor the level of covenant as well. As I've said earlier, it's not a static thing, so an employer's covenant will vary over time and with world events. Whatever you did to assess the employer's covenant in the first place, make sure you have a way to update the views taken as part of that assessment. Then once you've assessed the covenant of your employers, you can factor this into their funding approaches. There are many ways in which you can do this, but the main methods used in the LGPS are set out in this slide. So the first is employer categorization. You put the employers into risk categories, which then influence how prudent you might be in terms of their funding, how long you're willing to set the recovery period, and so on. The employers with the weakest covenants would be expected to have the most prudent approach. And you can use this approach to encourage employers to provide some form of guarantee or security, because by doing so, that will help move them up the ladder, give them more flexibility in terms of their funding and contribution plans. Another approach is to look at the investment strategies which are attached to each employer and to adopt a strategy that's tailored to the riskiness of the employer. So for example, if you have an already risky employer, then you might want to adopt a low-risk investment strategy to reduce the level of investment risk taken. This would, however, then require higher contributions from the employer, so the overall impact on the employer and on the fund should be considered. In practice, assets are held on a fund level as well, so if you want to adopt different strategies by employer, then you can do this physically or notionally. But generally, if tailored investment strategies are used, the most common approach is to do it notionally and by groups of employer rather than by an individual employer. And finally, and this follows on from the tailored investment strategy approach, you could use a different discount rate. You can do this whether or not you do use tailored investment strategies. If you do, then different discount rates will fall naturally out of that approach. If you don't, then you can build into your funding strategy a risk-based discount rate approach, whereby higher risk employers have a more prudent discount rate and vice versa. This will require higher contributions from higher risk employers, which will minimise the risk to the fund that there will be a deficit left when an employer defaults. The affordability to the employer under such an approach should be considered, as you don't really want to stretch the employer so much that it causes the employer to default. So let's look at a quick case study to demonstrate how assessing employer covenant can help an LGPS fund and its employers. So an LGPS fund asks us for a quantitative analysis of its employers. So we looked at their latest valuation results combined with external risk scores. Allowing also for any existing guarantees or security that was in place, we helped the fund to identify their riskiest employers. We and the fund met with the employer who had the greatest combined risk of default and deficit at risk, which was a deficit in the region of 20 to 30 million pounds. We engaged in advance the next actuarial valuation to discuss how their contributions would be impacted if they did or they didn't put in place any additional security. On looking at the employer's accounts, we could see that they had high value property, and following discussions with the employer was keen to put forward a fixed charge on their property as security in return for more affordable contributions. The value of the property that they had available would have been more than enough to cover the deficit at risk. In this situation, they actually did need more time and couldn't put in place these arrangements in time for the valuation. Therefore, to reflect that there was no security, we used the lower deficit recovery period to set their contributions, which led to higher amounts being required and reduced risk to the fund, because the employer's outstanding deficit would be recovered more quickly. However, we acknowledge that the employer was keen to put in place some form of security, so we'll review this again, and if security is put in place, then we can perhaps reverse the lower deficit recovery period to give the employer more affordable contributions. The employer covenant work was extremely useful, and in addition to leading to reduced risk for the fund in respect of this particular employer, it gave the fund an overall better understanding of its employers and their relative levels of risks to the fund. So in summary, it's very important to keep an eye on the riskiness of your employers, and there are different ways of doing this depending on how in-depth you want your analysis to be. Monitoring employer covenant helps the fund demonstrate good governance and risk management of the fund. Once you have the results of your analysis, you need to think about how you put that in practice. How do you reduce the risk? And then how does that then feed into the contributions that an employer pays? Hopefully that's given you some food for thought. Please do get in touch with your usual Barnett Waddingham contact for any further information. And from me, thank you for listening and goodbye.